Welcome to this month's Conservation Conversations. I'm Sean O'Brien, the President and CEO of NatureServe. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to studying biodiversity and working to conserve biodiversity to help reduce the impacts of the sixth extinction. And we use these conservation conversations to touch on all topics related to biodiversity and thinking about these issues and the people involved in conserving biodiversity. And this month, we're here with Dr. Catherine Febria, who is the Canada Research Chair and Assistant Professor in Freshwater Restoration and Ecology at the University of Windsor. She came there by a circuitous route, and we'll hear more about that over the course of the conversation about how she came to land up there. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. I have several things that I want to talk about. You've got quite a varied background in the things that you've written about and done research on. But I want to start with a very sort of classic, more classic sort of biodiversity conversation.
Yeah.
One of the things that you and your students and people in your lab do is sort of looking at biodiversity in urban areas or places that are surrounded by people. And we tend to think of biodiversity as like this thing where you need like giant parks or you need big landscapes or something. And I want to just dig in a little bit on the idea of like looking at biodiversity in these channelized streams and urban wetlands that you look at.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I just love, and I know I'm trained as an ecosystem ecologist, so I really do think about connectivity from like the most molecular sense up to, the whole planet. And the more and more I was doing research on freshwater, which is my passion, I realized that, the places where people live, whether they be our cities and neighborhoods, but also where we get our food, so farms, there's this rich connection between human and nature, but not in the way that, biodiversity in nature is often communicated or shown to us. And I really wanted to engage that. I think it was really clear that, a lot of the science, especially when I was coming up in training, was on more natural spaces and the draw to look at nature in these far off places. But I grew up in a city and I grew up in the Great Lakes and I knew that I wanted to understand how I could, help restore and protect where I lived. And more people are moving and living in cities, and we all require food that have been grown somewhere. And that was really a key science gap. Then I knew biodiversity is so important and, drives and it underpins all of our livelihood. And that's something that we wanted to engage. And rather than kind of going somewhere else to do science, I wanted to do place-based science and really get to know the places that we call home.
Which is really great. And if people go to your website and look at the videos on there, it's really fun to watch the scientists sort of wading out in their waders.
Yeah.
These sort of
concreted drains.
Yeah, exactly. Next to the culverts and all of this, but then finding really interesting things in the water there.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like wearing the scientist hat, I remember really early on as a graduate student, looking at some of the earliest papers like written by ecologists. And, even my favorite one was the first paper in 1935 by Arthur Tansley that defined ecosystem. And in it, there was a passage that's like everything, things are connected from the molecule up to the whole universe, and they interact, overlap, interlock, those sorts of things. And we need to look at things separately, but, we have to proceed looking at the connection. And, that really galvanized my interest, this idea that how do we study connections? And, my first science tool was thinking about carbon and nutrients and how they interact. And that is ultimately what underpins all biodiversity. And so thinking about how do I do that where I am or in places. And I think seeing it through that lens, you see that everything is connected. It doesn't matter where you are on the planet.
So you talked about interconnectedness and interlocking things, and that leads me to think about some other things that you've written about in your career. So you've done research in New Zealand and you think a lot about water, and you've written about sort of collective action in science, sort of the way that science is set up. And so this is a whole series of questions, and I'll just try and do one rather than some giant compound question. So the first question is, you're talking about this interconnectedness, and that leads me to think about the the Wangui, is that
Wanganui, the Wanganui
Wanganui
River.
River in New
Yeah.
Zealand that has been granted personhood status by the government there, which led to other countries essentially creating this category for bodies of water and rivers. And I'm just curious about like what that means in terms of the way that we do science and the way we look at the connection between people and their environment. And then also what that means in terms of the future of conservation. So maybe that second part we can get back to, because that's a lot all in one question.
Well, I think, so I lived and worked in Aotearoa, which is the indigenous and traditional name for New Zealand, the land of the long white cloud, and Te Waiponema, which is the South Island. And it was really nice to be there working as a scientist at a time where I was thinking about how do we connect science with people and how do we do science in a way that's ethical and relationship based, because that was something I really felt was missing from a lot of, mismatches in science and policy or science and management, or when things aren't working and we have the science, why is it not mobilized into action? So the tool of like a legal tool, like personhood status, was certainly driven by communities. And I think, in North Island, I wasn't, it was driven by local indigenous communities wanting to really recognize that rivers are living things and a relation and something that has that deserves protection. And I do see it kind of translating into these conversations globally around how can we reframe our relationship to nature. And so that's kind of the way that I think about it. My t-shirt at the moment says like River Doctor, what a student made it for me. And it was really thinking about how do we as science, that's how it looks like in action, is how do we as scientists use the skills and the tools to, reconnect rivers to their landscapes and people to their landscapes. And how do we use and need different types of scientists to try and again, relate to water. So it could be looking at, something like monitoring, which allows us to see what is the state of our ecosystem, and then looking at things like nutrient fluxes to see how healthy are things functioning. And this relationship of, what is the status of a river as a living being would kind of reflect not only the biodiversity that's there, but the processes that it supports and the people and the relationships that we need to steward our watersheds for the benefit of, future generations. And I think that's something, that when we think about how that relates to science, we really have in our group set an intention to try and use science to ensure that it is equitable, accessible, and really thinking about future generations. It's taken generations for the health of our waterways, some of the most degraded ones, to get to the state that it's in. Yet we're still trying to find the silver bullet, like we want to solve it right away. Yeah. But it is hoping to reframe that if we're in good relationship with each other and thinking about the timelines that it will take to restore some of these ecosystems, that maybe by, taking local actions and connecting them to this broader goal and aspiration, we can hopefully accelerate it and achieve, improved health in these ecosystems sooner than if we remain siloed. So I think, whether it's a legal tool like personhood status, I think it's really important and one of many things we need to do, but it doesn't, I'm hoping it inspires scientists to really think about how can they connect their work to communities that are implementing it, and really thinking broadly as science as being one of many things that we need to do to restore biodiversity on this planet.
Yeah, so I think that leads me correctly to be thinking about your article that you're co-author on
the collective action
is needed to build a more just science system. And so I want to sort of unpack that, because it's for the uninitiated, that's a lot of words. And so if you could explain what that means, because I think it's really important in the way we think about science and indigenous knowledge and the rights of people who've been on the land. And
I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you for the invitation. I wanted to acknowledge this collective, a group of scientists working in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We were originally under the umbrella term of kindness in science, and it was an exercise in trying to honor things like our treaty responsibilities as scientists. When we gather as a room under the New Zealand's founding treaty of Maori and non-Maori, it's like 50% of us were Maori and 50% of us were non-Maori, a range of early career and senior science practitioners, ecology, computer science, complexity theory, all coming together to really understand how is the science system built is it really achieving collective societal, beneficial impacts? And, in that context, we really wanted to root ourselves in the local context, which was the Aotearoa science system. And we could see that it was a lot of big changes that needed to happen to make science more inclusive and accessible and impactful, but also a lot of individual things. And it was really a space for us to have these conversations around like, what should science, like, what is the benefit and impact of science? How can, a biodiversity scientist and a complexity theory mathematician, how do we all kind of engage the system that we're in and shift us so we're moving forward in a way that benefits not only our own scientific, interests, but actually societal impact. Many of us receive public funding. Many of us receive, or do work in community, or at least are driven by wanting to do science that's ethical and equitable and impactful. So how can we all kind of move forward in the same direction? And so that paper that you cited came out in Nature Human Behavior, really thinking about, and using nature as an inspiration. I think one of the examples is a flock of birds, like really kind of maybe disordered, but highly eventually moving in an ordered state moving forward. And I think we're starting to see shifts like that in our science system. And it requires everyone. It really is this whole of community approach, having conversations about, what are we asked to do with our tools? What is this? Here's a funding opportunity. How is it, innovative, blue skies, but also really lifting communities that need to or are interested in that species. And so I've been privileged to work with organizations that have really put those values into practice, including New Zealand's Biological Heritage Science, a national sort of science challenge that has really done a lot of work on design thinking. Like, it doesn't happen just because people love nature. There's just different ways that we need to do those things. And it is really about moving forward together and weaving in the bits that work. And some things move sooner than others, but actually still continuing to support, early career researchers, partnering communities with scientists. So scientists can still do what they might be great at doing, but it is connected to, maybe a community that is interested in that science, or knowledge keepers that have complementary information. And, if we are really thinking about bioheritage, don't we want all of the knowledge systems as possible, and don't we want those people in the next generation to have it sooner? And so I do think that that's been it's hard work, but I do see so many benefits, more than just the science papers that emerge when you really think about really moving everyone up together.
So I want to talk about one other thing first, or second, but first I wanted to ask you to talk about knowledge keepers and pulling together all of the information that we have in order to conserve what we have and to restore nature and make it available to people. That's a really interesting challenge that we have, is gathering that information in a way that makes it useful to science, but also respects its origins and protects some of the essentially intellectual property that comes from that knowledge that goes back from generations of people living on the land. And I'm imagining you've had to navigate a little bit of that.
Yeah, and it looks so different. I mean, when I first landed in New Zealand, for example, I would spend a lot of time working with farmers. Like, on the surface, what do we have in common? I'm an immigrant to Canada and transplanted to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and didn't know anything about dairy farming. But I think, it was really important because they are stewarding headwaters, the agricultural wetlands and urban wetlands and small drains that are buried. And it was really about trying to find ways to relate to one another and trying to find a common ground for understanding. And they had so much knowledge. We would talk to them about rain patterns and, certain plant relationships. And they would say, they had such precision in their memory around that. And we would want to engage that in our experiment. And likewise, when we work with Indigenous communities, and that knowledge, it is really about our approach in the lab is really I don't go anywhere. We're not invited. We aren't trying to extract information, but really by fostering a space and listening for the ways in which science can help, then that is kind of, we go to community and offer the services that are of interest. And so it is really thinking about building the relationships first. And that's what the Farm Advisory Board group in our lab, as well as the Indigenous Knowledge Circle, is really about supporting one another and thinking about what are the needs. And from that, the science emerges. If we're constantly thinking about it, this plant, even conversations about an invasive plant, other knowledge systems will say well, what's invasive? We might still just need to get to know it. And that's an invitation for us to do an ecological study, do a biomonitoring, and not just thinking about the species, but the relationships to other plants or flow regimes. And I think by being open to the questions and the knowledge and lived experience from people in these watersheds, the science question, a more interesting science question emerges than the one that I might have, thought. And I think if we embrace and do that equitably, it takes more time, but those are the things that I think are worth investing in, because it really did help things like, during COVID, for example, we had relationships with farmers and communities before it happened. There was a trust there, so we could continue sampling, farm fields and going into community and doing water quality monitoring, because they trusted that, we were, working in partnership. And I think, there's just so many ways. And then again, when we have the results, talking to them about what we found, they almost validated what we as scientists might have seen or thought, or what might have driven a certain pattern. And so I think, I guess that openness to, and maybe even an element of decolonizing what we think science is doing, like really being open to saying there's different ways to interpret or do or ask or answer these questions. It allows to not only, a more impactful science outcome, especially, on the ground when we're doing restoration, but also broader relationships that, really leverage and launch us into other new exciting things like mentoring youth. And we now have a lab that does more than just aquatic. We've started to do vegetational plant sampling because they live in relationship to wetlands, and those lessons that we've learned have been really exciting, and it really is helping keep us rooted to the local biodiversity in the region, but really thinking about these ecosystems as holistic systems that have aquatic organisms and terrestrial ones, humans, and animal beings. Like, we're all in that space. And that's been really, I think, the biggest teacher, is just by having that openness and really funding and supporting those values, we've been able to have really great science emerge, but also really great partnerships.
I'm going to interrupt myself and pause my follow-up question with a different follow-up question first, which is, you mentioned decolonizing science, and I've heard people talk about decolonizing things like bird watching and stuff like that.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of define that for people who may not have heard about that?
Yeah.
Or concerned about
We
that?
just had a conversation about that actually just in lab meeting, because we got someone asking what is the difference. And there's been such great other science practitioners in our global community. More recently, I read like Pollution is Colonialism by Max Liboiron, where there's a really nice passage talking about decolonization versus anti-colonialization. And, in its more simpler term, one way to kind of reverse the impacts of colonization would be like decolonization. And the way that it shows up for me in our group is, thinking that we are researchers, and I'm an academic professor that teaches in university settings. One way that shows up is I've like really intentionally moved towards land-based teaching and making spaces for knowledge keepers to share their knowledge, and that, it's no longer the university's role to do that, but actually, returning learning back to the land and reframing that relationship. In some other broadest sense, it is returning land back to Indigenous peoples who have, who were removed from those landscapes. And so it is really thinking about, what does that look like? And so that's one element, is like really trying to intentionally reverse the impacts of colonization. And then there's so many other ways that we can address colonization through anti-colonial. So any other ways. So there might be feminist theory and queer theory and, Afrofuturist theory. And I think in our group, we do have a lot of feminist kind of methodologies and feminist ways of leading that show up in our group. And so we kind of do different things, but it is that intention around like, do we have the knowledge? What are we trying to do here? And what is the best way to honor the different science tools that could be useful and the people that we're engaging? And so it looks like a lot of different things. Our projects, for example, we have, again, our farm advisory board and our Indigenous Knowledge Circle who help advise and walk, and we want to walk with, but also means things like co-leadership. So we tend to have projects where it's not just one person that knows it. We have people that have diverse gifts. And so it is thinking about how do we build a team? So it's really more like a nest versus like an empire. And how do we kind of provide the supportive base so that students can learn, but also lead? How can we, again, decenter the science as the solution, and how do we kind of lean towards knowledge keepers, whether they be settler farmers that have known this land and water for generations, or language holders where there's teachings wrapped up in words and species that have been here, and what does that tell us about a restoration goal for the region? So those are the different ways that it shows up, and I think the hard part for a lot of people is that there's not one way to do it and there's not one definition, but it is really the work on each of us to think about what is the individual, but also collective goal for, me in this science space or me doing this biodiversity work.
And that, I think, leads to your paper in Science, or your perspective in Science, the heartbeat of ecosystems. And so you've obviously thought about ecosystem health in lots of different perspectives and lots of different kinds of habitats. And I feel like your conversation about, how do we define ecosystem health, right? You say in the paper, we define human health in obvious ways, longevity and mobility and things like that. But it's harder with ecosystems. And I think when you think about ecosystems in a more holistic, like less just sort of like, oh, there's a forest over there, but it's a forest that is in relationship to everything around it and to the people around it, you may get a different answer.
Right, exactly. And I think, thanks for asking that. I think that's the thing that's been really tricky for restoration, is that there's been a lot of tree planting or actions in a watershed, but it's often been disconnected with maybe where in the watershed we might need to do it. Because it is the social implementation, communities have to get around doing a lot of that restoration action, but doing it in one place doesn't necessarily guarantee the prompt recovery of species somewhere else, also in that watershed or in that region. And there isn't a consensus on what combination of things we should be measuring, because it is hard work. And I've had the privilege of doing biodiversity work on a range of invertebrates in these watersheds in the Great Lakes. And again, like comparing data sets, people had been measuring things differently, or one organization was collecting one bit of biodiversity data, and then another organization might have been collecting it in others. And so I think really trying to bring back connection to measuring things in a similar way, but also looking at organisms and what other organisms they might be in relation to in the similar watershed, those have been really interesting, science outcomes that have emerged by really thinking holistically about, how are these things connected? What is the structure of it? But what does that tell us about how well this system is functioning? And how can we use that information to, mobilize the conservation practitioners who we deeply appreciate to make the choices that they need to do and have at least the best available science?
Right. So I think that's really great. And I want to switch gears a little bit, because you come at this from a different perspective, I think, because you have a different perspective than my background, right? But you have an interesting background. You mentioned before that you're an immigrant to Canada, but that you were working in New Zealand. Yeah. But you also worked in other parts of the world and have experience in other parts of the world. So I just want to tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you to be engaged in thinking about ecology and conservation work.
Oh, thanks. So I was born in Luzon in Manila, the country we now call the Philippines. I've had the privilege to have different just roots there. My dad's from the Visayas and the island of Cebu and Leyte, and I'm really proud to be, a descendant of those family lineages, but also, European and other places. And but I immigrated to the Great Lakes when I was really young, and I grew up on the shores of Lake Ontario and the east end of the city of Toronto. And, the Great Lakes have been home and have taught me so much about, just my place in the world, because you feel very, I think, I felt like I lived and, my culture at home. I also went to a French school. I grew up in a Great Lakes in a big city. And I think I've always been interested about in the world, but also felt very connected to water. And when, I came of age at a time where a lot of things were like, whether it's the ozone hole or acid rain or other things, there were a lot of environmental challenges threatening water and our ecosystems. And I was naturally really interested in science, or good at it, and really interested, again, in the tension of local and global. So how am I here? But like, there's this planet, and these things are all connected. What can I do as one person in this city, in this region? But also had a sense of responsibility to the planet. So I think, as I went through university, I did as many field courses as I could take. I did an environmental science undergrad, but it took me to places like Costa Rica and Barbados and Northwest Territories. And that really did help launch me into getting to know water around the world. My master's was on the Mackenzie River Basin in Northwest Territories, but I did that out of Vancouver. And so getting to know water and, again, shifting my perspective on a pretty regular basis has, I think, kept me humble that, we can know so many things about one place and then it changes. And then you grow as a scientist, the more things you learn. And I think by the time I finished my PhD, which was back in the Great Lakes on intermittent streams, I realized just how underappreciated the smallest of streams, wetlands, and headwaters were, and that the science was really important in a climate change context, but also that these were the most numerous ones on the watershed. And again, these essays like Tansley, this idea that these things are really connected, but we are not protecting them as well. And they harbor biodiversity that's like the microscopic scale and invertebrate scale. And that's what led me to move to the University of Maryland, where I worked with Margaret Palmer, where we were thinking about science and policy and the protection, the legal status of intermittent streams, and how things like the ecosystem tools of looking at carbon and those things were so useful, but doing it in partnership with science agencies like USGS and EPA at the time to think about, how are these connected? How are we protecting them? And that ultimately led me on a path of thinking about how do we restore them. And so the science tools are so vitally important. But it was at that point where I pivoted and I realized actually I need to engage the human dimensions as well, because when we think about these smallest streams in urban settings and agricultural impacted ones, it's individual farmers, individual, people mowing their lawn that are making those decisions. And how do I really try to work at that tension of local to global and thinking about individual decision making and mobilizing that for the benefit of these larger rivers that we care about and this whole, the planet. And it is a really tricky space to work in because there's not one way to do it. And there's a lot of science telling us about how we're doing it wrong. And it was really clear that the rooted work in a watershed with community was the best way I could use the science skills. And coming through it again, like in a different perspective, and thinking about inclusion, thinking about whose knowledge, when you're from somewhere, like you don't assume that, this one way of knowing is the only way of knowing. I'm always thinking about, okay, well, what language and, what perspective is needed. And so I think that was the privilege of interdisciplinary training, even though I was always really passionate about water and biodiversity, just knowing that there are other forces that shape its protection. It was really important to get to know sooner than later.
You're always saying so many interesting things that I have too many follow-ups in my head at the same time.
Sorry.
So one quick one on that was, it's really interesting. There's different ways of knowing and different ways of experiencing an area. And so I think about, like, when I go on a hike, I'm just sort of enjoying the big system and also probably looking at birds. But I often go on walks with botanists who don't really care much about the birds. They don't look up much. They're looking down.
They're looking down.
And then you might go on a hike with somebody who's a hunter or a fisher, and they're seeing the exact same place in a totally different way. They're thinking about the way that the habitat interacts with larger species of mammals and birds that are ground nesting instead of flying around. And so I think and then of course, if you went out with a person whose ancestry went back generations on that landscape, they might have a totally different perspective of what they're seeing in the cultural landscape that's in the space that is a natural landscape. I just think that's so interesting to think about. It's amazing that you're incorporating that.
Well, and I think that's the thing, like as a site, like it's that humility check. Like we might know a lot of things about this one thing, but actually making space for all the other ways. And they don't compete, they actually complement. And I think that's another intentional kind of maybe one of the outcomes of taking a decolonial or anti-colonial approach. Just like science is important. It's just not the most important thing all the time. And when thinking about the lived histories, like I have the privilege of working right along the Detroit River, and it is also very much, seen as a place and an important pivotal point as part of the Underground Railroad. So there's like a human, there's really rich human connections and stories of people who've been here all along, and people that have been settled here, and people that have been, that have known this place for a long time. And I do think honoring that is maybe the most responsible way I can be a scientist here, and really making the point that, the work that we're trying to do is really to help and to accelerate positive outcomes for nature and people.
That's great. So the other thing that I was thinking about was sometimes in our field, it's pretty easy to think, wow, this problem is bigger than we can manage. We have species going extinct at 1,000 times the background rate, and climate is changing. And, all across the world right now, people are experiencing just crazy weather, heat waves, and all of this. But earlier you mentioned two things that 20 years ago we thought, boy, are we ever going to be able to work our way out of these, right?
Right.
Acid rain and the ozone hole.
Ozone, I know.
Were these things that were like, this is going to, like, the planet is really going to pot, right? Because these two problems. And we've actually done
science helped.
pretty decent job
of
working through those.
Yeah, it's pretty much in the rear view, but that's kind of what I remember. I know it's, I was really inspiring to see that science was useful and that it helped, and that the collective impact, like policy around the world, that helped change those things. So, I mean, that's kind of what I hope our story is, and the work I'm hoping will speak for itself. It's that this is a way that we were able to mobilize a lot of collective action for good. I think the future generations deserve that. I want that. I sort of think about how all of our interactions, what is the goal? Is it to, be the scientist at the top of the mountain or something? But no, actually it is to make sure that the stewards and next generations have known what worked and what didn't, and how that we did our best to try and really ensure, biodiversity was there, and nature and the people stewarding it now did the best that they could. And so that's a lot of, I know there's, work that we're doing locally, but it is why I continue to work even globally, because I do think connecting information is probably the one thing we need to do better at, especially in climate change. I think, I know there was, the IPCC is the climate change equivalent, and I have the privilege of working with the biodiversity equivalent of it at best. And capacity strengthening has been such an important thread of that, which we didn't see in the IPCC. And so I'm hoping that my involvement in the global sphere will help kind of turn the tide on things when it comes to biodiversity loss.
Yeah, but of course, IPBEX is a great thing that NatureServe thinks about a lot. You mentioned future generations, and of course, you run a lab with a lot of young people who you're mentoring, and so I'm thinking about, maybe you're not quite at the point where you're thinking about your legacy, but make you think about your legacy and what you hope, your students will say to their students about you, or what your children or your grandchildren might say about what you accomplished with your work and your research.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I spent a lot of time with young people. It's so inspiring. And a lot of times, especially in any university, they're like, oh, I just saw your lecture, but I'm in engineering. Is it too late? Or like, oh, I'm computer science. What happens? And I think more than anything, I really do spend a lot of time encouraging people in our team and in our network to do the work of getting to know themselves. What are they good at? And one of my Indigenous knowledge and collaborator partners will always kind of ask the youth, what are your gifts? And I think that's a really important question to ask of each of us, is like, what are we good at? What are you naturally drawn to? And I think when it comes to, protecting nature and thinking about the next generations, like, you just want people to be on a healing path if they have been disconnected from nature, or are experiencing traumas related to, at least in Canada, residential schools. If people are on a healing path, getting to know their culture or their language, or like me, from away, but find myself here, whatever path brought them to science, I really do encourage people to find and understand their own gifts and understand what they're good at and what might be harder. And every project in our group is very intentionally diverse, because it is a lot of this early work. If you ask students on our team, they're like, we interviewed for a very long time. Like, I was really just trying to, like, here's the project. What do you bring? How are you wanting to grow? Spend some time with people in the group, in the field, and really try to ensure that, they come out of their time in this group knowing themselves, knowing what they're really passionate about. And that means creative skills too. We've had some wonderful artists come out of our group. And we've had some wonderful musicians, just like music and art and photography and video. And that's all really showcased in our lab's social media profile. And even the way they've reclaimed social media as storytelling for, like, that's how they really see their gifts. And I think making space for that. So I'm hoping they see their time with the group and in our projects as a time where they invested in themselves to become better stewards for the future. And I hope that there's not one way, like, that it looks like the fingerprint of my, the small time that they might have in our group is maybe little, and it won't look the same, but I'm hoping they can draw a thread of connect to the time where they were able to invest in themselves to be, a leader in their own way, and that it wasn't about following my path, but really truly following their own.
And so, because that question has been asked in your lab many times,
Yeah.
I'm assuming you have an answer to what are your gifts.
Well, I realized that thinking in different ways, I remember being at a young age and I realized I could think in different languages. It wasn't obvious to me. And I realized, okay, when I'm home, I'm talking to my grandma. We call her Lola, and that's Tagalog. And when I go to school, that's French, and that's Grammaire. And I think I just naturally was curious about the world. Number one, there's no set. I think people have said you have no shortage of questions, but also just my ability to really shift to different perspectives is something that I at first thought was really hard. Like, why can't I be the scientist that just does this thing? Because my brain is also thinking about this and that. And when I realized that there is a space and a need for bridging and being a boundary spanner and being interdisciplinary, and that was something that naturally came to me, then I was like, okay, I'm just going to lean into this now and just realize that that's helpful. And sure enough, all of our projects really reflect that. There's some that are focusing on species and some that are thinking about restoration, and really being the connective tissue type person is something that over time it's been revealed as being something that I seem to do a little bit easier. Always thinking about who should be included, or just thinking about how do we connect and how do we make it accessible is something that I just seem naturally poised to do. And that could be overwhelming, I'm sure, for my students, thinking they have to do everything. But again, I think by the end of it, the projects and their work and what they go on to do kind of speak for themselves. They find their path and they realize things are important, and they just need to figure out what their path is going to be.
I think that is awesome. And I think it's also awesome that because of that, you're able to welcome so many people into science and into thinking about how to be part of the solution to the challenges that the planet is facing. And so I want to thank you for that, and for the work that you're doing and the mentoring that you're doing with all the students. And I can't wait to see the work that comes out of the legacy that you have with all these students.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate the time with you today.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us. And I want to thank everyone for listening to this month's Conservation Conversations. Remember that NatureServe is a nonprofit organization, and you can help us by liking this podcast, giving us good reviews, assuming that you like us. And you can also go to natureserve.org, and you can get links to Catherine's lab through the Conservation Conversations section of our website. And you can also make donations to NatureServe to support our work to promote the conservation of biodiversity across the planet. And thanks for joining us. And thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.